million Nigerians are not connected to the national power grid, according to a World Bank report. That is about 43% of the population. For those connected, power supply is erratic and does not meet demand. As it is, Nigeria has the highest energy deficit in the whole of West Africa. The nation's electricity supply industry is battling infrastructure constraints across the entire value chain, from obsolete generation plants and equipment to inadequate and poorly maintained transmission and distribution networks. Right now, average operational generation capacity is less than half of the total installed generation capacity, and even the generated power is not efficiently distributed. While the country has the potential to generate 12,522 megawatts of electric power from existing plants, on most days it is only able to dispatch around 5,000 megawatts, which is clearly insufficient for a country of over 195 million people. Nigeria's power deficit has huge consequences for Nigeria's development. While the global economy is slowly beginning to recover from the recent COVID-19 recession, Nigerian industries continue to lag behind, unable to grow and be competitive without affordable and reliable power. There is, many argue, a direct correlation between our dysfunctional power sector and our inability to grow our economy and create jobs and enable development. While the present government has initiated some reforms in the sector, they do not seem to be having the desired effect of rapidly solving our decades-long power problem. Today on Pivotal, I'm joined by Malam Ahmed Zakari, Special Advisor to President Muhammadu Buhari of Nigeria on infrastructure, and Mr. Odion Omofoman, an energy expert and Chief Executive Officer of New Hampshire Capital Limited. Gentlemen, welcome to Pivotal.
Thank you very much for having me, and good evening.
Actually, if I could start maybe with you, Malam Ahmed Zakari. Why is it that despite the much touted benefits of privatization of the elements of the power sector, at least the distribution and the generation, the power situation in Nigeria still remains abysmal by whatever standard we measure it?
Thank you, Kadri, and thank you for having me today, and happy Easter to everyone watching. The situation on power, as I've stated a number of times, is something that understandably Nigerians are impatient about and should be impatient about. But I think in looking forward, it's important to understand where we've come from. And successive governments have taken different measures to improve the situation. But I think we're on a path now where there's a clear understanding from everyone on what the challenges are. Back in 2003, we had an installed generating capacity of maybe 3,000 to 4,000 megawatts. And if you can't generate, you definitely cannot get any power to transmit or distribute. At the time, there was a big emphasis on increasing generation capacity. But in that period, the investment in transmission and distribution did not keep a pace. And in 2013, there was a realization, as enshrined by the Electric Power Sector Reform Act, that we needed to move to a more private sector-driven distribution segment of the sector, whereas transmission was maintained by the government. And with all new things, there was a number of growing pains. Transitioning Nigerians from the standpoint of, power at the distribution end, which interfaces with the customer, as a commodity you should pay for, and not a commodity that you should receive for free and subsidized. We've struggled with that. And successive policy decisions have not allowed the cost-reflective tariff to be charged to the consumer.
Mr. Edion, you heard Malam Zakari there, and it seems as if, again, consumers are somewhat indirectly getting blamed for the power issues that we see in this country. There's issue of the inability to charge competitive tariffs. But then privatization program was supposed to bring in people who were supposed to sort out the problems, particularly in distribution and generation, by pumping money. And we see time and time again, government still in some ways providing subsidy for private sector companies. So what do you make of this issue of tariffs, and what exactly is going wrong in the privatized power sector that means we've not been able to get the full benefits of privatization, in your view?
Okay, in my view, it's pretty straightforward. The assumptions that were used for privatization, particularly the distribution end, a lot of it were unrealistic to my mind. For instance, there's a presentation where the former Minister of Power actually assumed that if remittances from discos were up to 50%, privatization had failed, and that was a worst case scenario. The MITO tariffs were pretty set very low. The bid prices, or rather the ATC and C losses that the bidders won the discos with, they were not correlated to the capex requirements or the actual investments in the tariff. So what you had was a cocktail of promises versus reality being far apart. Unfortunately, regulatory issues have also worsened it, because you're supposed to have biannual review of the tariffs and then 5-year review of the MITO tariffs. We have a situation where these reviews weren't done as and when they were supposed to happen. And what has happened is you have investors who are supposed to invest money in, but they cannot recover that investment because you have tariffs that do not match the investments they've made. And we then have this issue where they can't bring in the funds. Having said that, I also think we have a structural issue in the markets, the power sector market, and if we don't solve the structural issues, we'll keep throwing money at this thing, at the sector, without seeing commensurate returns. The first structural issue is the fact that distribution seems to be the weakest link, and you have customers who are definitely not happy with the quality of service that you're getting. So what would happen is that there will be a reluctance to pay. Number two, you have a huge metering gap where over 60% of customers on the registers of distribution companies are not metered, right? So that cocktail alone is enough to get people to be really, really frustrated. But listening to Malam Zakari, you would hear presidential issues, you hear presidential, everything is coming from the federal government. The question to ask is, where are the state governments who are closest to the last mile customer, right? That is, for me, is the most fundamental flaw in the whole electricity market, where everything is being done by the federal government, and there's nothing the state governments are really able to do because of the way the market is structured. And we must address that structural inefficiency in the market.
Let me actually ask him straight away. So there's a recognition that perhaps the privatization program, the way it was initially put together, was fundamentally flawed. But what Mr. Odion seems to be saying is that we are not doing things in a way that enables us, if you like, repair the initial flaws, because we keep centralizing everything that we do, rather than decentralizing some of the things. Absolutely. And enabling those who are closer to the problem to sort of be part of providing the solution. And so we seem to be compounding the issue. What are your thoughts on that particular matter that he has raised?
Okay, so I think there was a statement around, blaming the consumer. I think the administration's position is the most pro-consumer position that has happened since the advent of the Power Sector Reform Act and the privatization. Now, if you look at it, there are structural issues, as Mr. Odion has said. One, if a product costs 5 naira, what usually businesses will do is make efficiencies to make it cost 4 naira, and they can get more margins, rather than saying they should raise the price. But with successive governments where we've said, we're not going to worry about the efficiency and improving the infrastructure, we're not going to allow the distribution companies to start out with a tariff trajectory and then come down, as we agreed with them in the performance agreements, those structural issues caused problems. Furthermore, to exacerbate that, end users were unable to get metering that allowed confidence to be built in the system where I know what I've consumed. Everybody is in the mix on this thing. The Niger Delta Power Holding Company is 53% owned by the state governments. The discos are in the 40% from the government side, a range of anything from 11 to 25% of that 40 is still owned by the state governments. So even if passively, the state governments are actually investors in the sector. But we cannot keep doing the same thing and expecting a different result. So it's a very simple solution where allow market forces to work by having the economics that drive investment while leveraging available funds through loans to the distribution companies for infrastructure. Privately, they can execute them through boosting investment into the transmission company of Nigeria. And when you do that, this imbalance of 13, 15, line of sight to 20,000 megawatts, which would really help the country, versus the 5,000 that we're able to transmit and distribute, will be eliminated.
Okay, so herein I think lies the problem for many Nigerians when we talk about power, and indeed we see it perhaps in other sectors. We seem to get ourselves involved in privatization programs that are almost farcical, because we argue that the private sector is supposed to come in, put in money, do certain things, but somehow the way government sets up these things, it is never able to completely hands off and do the role of regulatory authorities that it should, so that the market in real terms determines everything that happens. I mean, the average Nigerian is now in a situation where you've sold off their assets, and now you're also taking money and borrowing and giving it to people that you sold assets to. It seems very, very confusing and a very confused strategy.
I mean, borrowing in itself is not gifting anyone's money. And in our development cycle as a country and across the world in developing countries, creating opportunities to finance infrastructure. Infrastructure is a big thing, has to be driven with government intervention. If we had a very large synchronized power sector and then we privatized it, that is a different case. We privatized to drive and catalyze investment. And if we remember, in the life of a nation, 2013 to date is not so long. But we know what works. Allowing the market fundamentals within reason to operate, to catalyze investment, as well as focusing on infrastructure and not consumption, is the way to go.
Let me take a quick break. And when we come back, we focus a little bit more on whether these things that are being done by the current government will make an appreciable difference. You are watching Pivotal, and we're talking electricity and power. in Nigeria. Don't go away. Welcome back to Pivotal, where I'm in conversation with Malam Ahmed Zakari, the Special Advisor to the President of Nigeria on Infrastructure, and Mr. Odion Omofowan, an energy expert and Chief Executive Officer of New Hampshire Capital Limited. Now, Mr. Odion, before the break, you heard Malam Zakari there talking about some of the ambitious programs that this administration is pursuing. But overall, do you believe that these are the sort of things that are required, that would change things and see Nigerians begin to enjoy the quality of power, but also the quantity of power that is required, and not just in homes, but also for businesses?
So yes, I think the present government is on the right track in terms of the initiatives that they've started. Let me also appreciate the efforts of Malam Zakari, who I know is one of the brains behind the National Mass Metering Program, and also commend the central bank for funding the program. However, everything we're talking about, we're relating to just 10, 15 million customers. We're a country with a population of almost 200 million customers. As at 2012, the households we have is about 42 million households. So effectively, the people without power or electricity is huge. And the central government, my argument is the federal government cannot do everything alone. You cannot have a centralized power market where everything is operated from a central regulation, central financing. The state governments, who are the closest to the last mile customer, need to get involved. And interestingly, the Constitution, there's a confusion where people say the state governments cannot do generation, cannot get involved in power. Yes, they can, because Section 13, Part 2 of the Constitution and 14 actually puts electricity in the concurrent list and specifically directs that state houses of assemblies can also create laws for electricity regulation and also making sure that their people have electricity to the extent that they don't have access to it from the grid. That is what we need to push now, for states to start to trigger their own regulatory environments that would enable investment at that last mile level. So currently you have the Electricity Act that says states, if you want to generate 1 megawatt and below, you don't need to go to Abuja. But guess what? If you want to distribute electricity outside of the discos, you can only do 100 kilowatt hours.
Malam Zakari, before we wrap up, can I ask you to quickly explain what has been described as the Azura debacle, a situation where the government of Muhammadu Buhari came in 2015 and signed an agreement that essentially commits us to paying money to this independent power plant, whether we're able to evacuate power from that plant or not. And we're stuck with that agreement apparently because if we fail, then the get out clause for that is something like 1.2 billion. This sounds like an issue around basically government not understanding the details of what it is getting into, and then it is now costing Nigeria a whole lot of money.
Look, I think there's a lot of misinformation on Azura. And if you look at it, most of those agreements, not to blame Shift, were already signed when this administration came in. And it was at a point where...
Except the PRG, which is the one that is problematic. Because that is... No,
the PRG...
Is the PRG...
Done. I've actually done an op-ed on Azura that I would encourage everyone to read. When the controversy came up some time ago, I did an op-ed to explain what the situation is. But let me make it simpler. In an environment, it's not like we're not taking the energy. Azura at points gets 90% dispatch. Where we had a problem was paying for that energy. We know we have a take or pay, so TCN prioritizes and Azura actually gets significant dispatch. Where we had a problem is not an Azura problem, it's a Nigerian power sector problem. We were paying 30 naira for every 100 naira of power from the consumer, and 70 naira was being covered by the government. We were spending, prior to the reforms we did on service-based tariff, we're spending 50 billion naira some months on subsidy. We've now significantly brought that number down. So one is is the energy that Azura is producing being consumed? The answer is yes. We take most of the energy. But the problem on not being able to pay for it is not an Azura problem. It's a Nigerian power sector problem. Other generators were having problems because it is inimical to say that a product costs this, you charge this for it, and then government scrambles to find the balance. Now, we've taken some reforms on liquidity that have significantly lessened the exposure on Azura. We raised effective tariff on the high-end users, on average, band A, B, and C, 36%. We now locked all of the revenues for the sector in CBN, and we now have a payment waterfall that ensures generation, transmission, and everybody gets their money and the discos take the balance. We raised that by 36%. We got a 65% increase in collection, and the exposure on Azura has reduced by about 60%. The only filler that the Nigerian government does for Azura is only on about 40% of their supply, which is because we're able to collect and remit more from the market.
Okay, so Mr. Odion, you heard Malam Zakari there. Are you completely satisfied with these reforms that have been instituted by this particular administration?
Okay, so I think we're on the right track, but we're not where we should be. There's a lot of investments now in the sector coming in from the federal government. So that's actually commendable. In terms of my four key steps, first, address the metering gap, which is what the federal government is currently doing. The issues of corporate governance with the discos. At the end of the day, we need to address the corporate governance issues in the market. The third is, and very important, we need to introduce more competition at the distribution level side of things. We cannot have one source of a national grid that transcends that covers the entire country. You will need to have regional grids. You need to have states controlling their power sector. The regulator actually come up with something called the eligible customer policy, which sort of tried to sort of introduce competition, but that is still at infancy, and I think we need to do more. And doing more means that we need to have decentralized power sector regulations. States now need to key into what the 1999 Constitution put out for them in section 13, part 2 of the Constitution, where the State House of Assembly can actually create laws, enact laws to regulate power within their states. That would mean that states can then own the power supply or own the power situation within their states. And then lastly, all market players need to adhere to market rules. There's so much indiscipline in the market. And again, thanks to Malam Zakari's team, they are making sure that there's a lot of payment adherence to payment rules. But at the same time, we need more enforcement of the market rules by both the NERC, the market operator, and other parties that should enforce these market rules so that we don't have an indisciplined market like we used to have.
Malam Zakari, I want you today to make specific commitments to Nigerians. What state will the power sector be in by the time this administration hands over to the next administration? And here, can you be quite specific about the things that you're committing to?
These are not my pronouncements. They're pronouncements from the government, right? And the administration as I'm an advisor, right? I think it's been very clear. President Muhammadu Buhari believes that all Nigerians must be metered and has committed that the metering gap will be eliminated within 18 to 24 months. We're already on the path.
This is for people who are on the grid, which is the minority of the Nigerian population.
People on the grid.
Okay.
Secondly, the unelectrified population through the Rural Electrification Agency, Ministry of Power, the state REDs, we're going to reverse the trend on a growing number of electrified, and we're going to start reducing those numbers.
Do you have a percentage of the reduction that you're looking at by the time you leave office? So what percentage of people who are not electrified currently would be electrified by the time you leave office?
I think I'll allow for those data to be revealed by the Ministry of Power and the Rural Electrification Agency. I think my brother Ahmed Salihijo may take issue to me committing him to numbers. If we were actually boosting out 10,000 megawatts of power, our tariff would be closer to 30 naira on average than 50 naira. So our problem is infrastructure to boost supply rather than trying to fight to keep the tariff low. And then lastly, I think we've communicated a number of investments and financing. We will catalyze investment through loans and federal government and state government funds to the tune of $2.5 to $3 billion. It's a combination of items that have been announced but not executed and money that will come in additionally.
Gentlemen, we've run out of time, so I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. You were watching Pivotal, and my guests were Malam Ahmed Zakari, the Special Advisor to the President of Nigeria on Infrastructure, and Mr. Odion Omofuman, an energy expert and the Chief Executive Officer of New Hampshire Capital Limited. And that's it for this month's edition of Pivotal. Wishing you a wonderful Easter.